You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 6,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The envelope materialized in my mailbox sometime between midnight and dawn, the way they always did. Not delivered, materialized. I'd learned the difference after watching my apartment building's security footage once, seeing myself check an empty mailbox at 11:47 p.m. and finding the cream-coloured parchment there at 6:23 a.m, with no record of anyone approaching in between. Tom Walker, written in that spidery handwriting that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. After 2 years of working for midnight courier services, I'd stopped trying to figure out how they knew where I lived, how they got past 3 deadbolts and a security system, or why the paper always smelled faintly of brine and copper. The company operated out of a warehouse that existed in the liminal spaces of Savannah's industrial district. Not abandoned exactly, but forgotten. The kind of building your eyes slid past even when you were looking for it. No sign, no phone number, no digital footprint whatsoever. Employment had found me during my darkest hour, 8 months unemployed, and 3 days from eviction, when a similar envelope had appeared with a simple message: "We have work for those who ask no questions." I'd started with small jobs, delivering antique music boxes that played melodies which made dogs howl 3 blocks away, transporting mason jars filled with what I'd convinced myself were just unusually shaped stones, though they'd whispered my name during thunderstorms. A Civil War surgeon's bone saw that still wept something dark when the humidity was right. Each delivery had left its mark. Tiny changes I'd noticed but ignored. The way my reflection sometimes showed scars I didn't remember getting. How I could hold my breath longer each month. The dreams of drowning that felt more like memories than nightmares. This envelope was different, heavier. When I opened it, the parchment inside was the colour of old bone and warm to the touch, like living skin. Package Retrieval, Pier 7, Warehouse District, sunset exactly. Drive only during darkness hours. Avoid interstate highways, toll roads, and any route monitored by federal agencies. Make no unnecessary stops. Do not make physical contact with the container. Under no circumstances should the container be opened before reaching its destination. Payment upon successful delivery, $15,000. The amount made my hands shake. In 2 years, I'd never seen a payment above $4,000. This was different. Final. The kind of money you paid someone when you didn't expect them to make other deliveries. The destination coordinates led to somewhere deep in the Florida Everglades, but when I tried to research the location, every satellite image showed nothing but swampland. No roads, no structures, no indication that humans had ever set foot there. Yet the coordinates were precise to the second, like someone had surveyed the area with instruments that could measure reality itself. I spent Thursday afternoon walking through Savannah's historic district, trying to convince myself to ignore the job. But the city felt different now. Tourists and locals moved through their routines, but I could see the spaces between their actions, the small wrongnesses that suggested something vast and patient was waking up beneath the surface of normal life. A street musician played a melody I'd heard in my drowning dreams. Pigeons flew in patterns that spelled words in languages that predated human speech. The Savannah River moved against its current for exactly 47 seconds while I watched, water flowing backward towards something that called from upstream. By sunset, I was at Pier 7. The crate was waiting like it had been there since the pier was built, though I knew it hadn't existed an hour earlier. 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, made from black iron that absorbed light so completely it seemed like a hole cut in reality. The brass locks binding it shut were covered in script that hurt to perceive. Not Etruscan, I realized, but something far older. Pre-human. The kind of writing that existed before intelligence had learned to separate thought from reality. Billy appeared to help with the loading, emerging from shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide a person. In 2 years of working together, he'd never spoken, but tonight words poured from his mouth like water from a broken dam. "They call it the confluence," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "The place where the deep roads meet the surface world. Where things that sleep in trenches deeper than mountains rise to reclaim what was always theirs." His skin had the texture of something that had spent too long underwater, pale and slightly translucent. "You're the last courier, Tom. After tonight, we won't need intermediaries anymore." 4 others emerged to help maneuver the crate into my truck. People I'd never seen before, yet somehow recognized. Their movements were too fluid, too synchronized, like dancers who'd rehearsed this exact choreography for decades. When they breathed, I heard the sound of waves on distant shores. The iron was so cold it burned my skin through thick gloves. The air around the crate shimmered with heat distortion, despite the freezing temperature, and my breath came out as steam that moved in spirals and formed shapes that looked almost like writing. "The Deep Mother has been patient," Billy continued as they secured the crate with chains that seemed to be made from the same impossible metal. "But patience has its limits, and the stars are finally right. The old contracts are coming due, and the debts must be paid." I wanted to ask what contracts, what debts, but the words died in my throat when Billy smiled. His teeth had been filed to points, and behind them I glimpsed rows of smaller teeth, like a shark's, receding back into his throat. "One last thing," he said, pressing something into my palm. A brass key, green with verdigris, warm as blood. "When you reach the confluence, when you see what's waiting there, remember that transformation is a choice. The Deep Mother values willing servants above slaves, and willing servants retain more of what they were." I looked at the key more closely and realized it was carved from a single piece of coral, shaped to look like brass. Inside the coral, tiny polyps moved like living jewels, pulsing with their own internal light. "What does it open?" Billy was already walking away, his footsteps leaving wet prints on the dry concrete. "The door between what you are and what you could become," he called back. "Use it wisely. The opportunity won't come again." I started south at 8:17 p.m., taking Highway 17 through Georgia's coastal lowlands. The route had been precisely outlined in the delivery instructions. Specific roads, exact turning points, even suggested speeds. "Stay invisible," the instructions emphasized. "Some cargo requires absolute secrecy." Within 20 minutes I understood why. The crate had begun to sing, not humming or vibrating, singing, in harmonies that seemed to come from multiple voices, layered impossibly deep. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and completely alien, like whale song filtered through crystalline structures and played backward through time. It resonated through the truck's frame and into my bones, synchronizing with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where the song ended and my pulse began. My radio didn't just die, it transformed. Instead of static, it picked up transmissions from impossible sources. Weather reports for cities that had sunk beneath the ocean millennia ago. Traffic updates for highways that ran along the bottom of the Mariana Trench. A late-night talk show where the host interviewed guests who had been dead since before the invention of writing. The GPS began showing my true location. For the first hour, it had displayed the correct route along Highway 17, but gradually the familiar coastline of Georgia dissolved into something else entirely. The screen showed me driving through underwater canyons, deeper than the Grand Canyon, following roads that ran along the edges of continental shelves and through forests of kelp, tall as redwoods. Depth readings appeared in the corner of the display. 200 feet below sea level, 500 feet, 1,200 feet. The truck's altitude, according to the satellite, was dropping steadily, even though I was driving on perfectly flat coastal highway. The temperature inside the cab plummeted, not gradually, suddenly, like someone had opened a door to the Arctic. My breath came out in clouds that formed patterns on the windshield, spirals and whirls that looked like tide pools viewed from above. But when I tried to wipe the condensation away, my hand came back wet with salt water. The singing from the crate grew more complex, adding harmonies that seemed to come from creatures with vocal cords shaped like nothing on Earth. Sometimes I could almost understand the words, not their meaning, but their intent. They were calling to something vast and patient that had been waiting in the deep places since before continents had learned to drift. Around midnight, as I crossed into Florida, the first of the escorts appeared, shapes moving in the darkness alongside the highway, keeping perfect pace with my truck. At first, I thought they were deer or wild boar, but deer don't move in formation, and wild boar don't swim through air like it's water. These were something else, long serpentine forms that undulated through the night sky like massive eels, their scales catching moonlight that shouldn't have been able to penetrate the cloud cover. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I accelerated, they accelerated. When I stopped at a red light in a small town whose name I couldn't remember 5 minutes after leaving it, they circled overhead like vultures, but vultures made of water and starlight and things that had never learned the difference between flying and swimming. My phone had been dead since crossing the Georgia state line, but now it flickered to life, displaying not missed calls or text messages, but something else entirely. Coordinates that shifted in real time, moving south through Florida like something alive. Tidal charts for locations that didn't exist. Depth soundings for trenches that hadn't been mapped by human science. The screen showed my location as 400 miles offshore, surrounded by a pod of creatures so large that the sonar couldn't determine where they ended and the ocean began. When I looked in my mirrors, my truck's shadow had too many angles, too many protrusions. Like whatever was casting the shadow had evolved for a world with different laws of physics, where geometry followed the whims of currents and pressure rather than the rigid mathematics of dry land. I needed gas around 2:30 a.m, so I pulled into a station that looked like it had been preserved from 1955. The pumps were the old mechanical kind with spinning dials, and the attendant watched me through glass, so thick it distorted his features into something almost aquatic. But when I started filling up, the numbers on the pump moved backward. Instead of taking fuel, my truck was somehow giving fuel to the station, the tank indicator showing fuller and fuller despite the gas flowing in the wrong direction. The attendant came outside, moving with the careful gait of someone walking underwater. When he saw the crate through my rear window, his face went through a series of expressions, too complex for human features: surprise, recognition, terror, and finally a kind of reverent awe. La Hashem Anakette, he whispered in what might have been Hebrew mixed with something much older. The deep mother returns to collect her children. He was ancient, not just old, but ancient, in a way that suggested he'd been here when this gas station was built, and would still be here when the ocean finally reclaimed the land around it. His skin had the translucent quality of deep-sea creatures, and when he moved, I could see things that might have been gills opening and closing behind his ears. "You know what I'm carrying?" "I know what you've become," he replied, and his voice carried the sound of waves breaking against rocks during a storm. "The question is whether you know." He handed me a brass compass that pointed not north but towards something that pulled from beneath the Earth's crust. My family has served the deep current for 7 generations, waiting for this night. The confluence opens only when the barriers are thinnest. when the walls between worlds become permeable enough for the Ancient Ones to pass through. What happens when I make this delivery? His smile revealed teeth that were shaped like shells, each one perfect and white and utterly wrong for a human mouth. You stop making deliveries for the Deep Mother and start making them as the Deep Mother's voice in the surface world. The age of intermediaries is ending, Tom Walker. The age of direct action has begun. He pressed something else into my hand. A small vial filled with water that moved like it was alive, forming tiny whirlpools and currents despite the container being perfectly still. When you reach the confluence, when you see what's waiting in the deep places, drink this. It will help you remember who you were before the transformation, so you can choose who you become after. I tried to pay for the gas, but he laughed and shook his head. Currency becomes meaningless when the old contracts come due. Tonight, we all pay in transformation. As I drove away, I watched him in my rearview mirror. He didn't go back inside the station, just stood there watching my truck disappear into the distance. And I had the distinct impression he would still be standing there when the sun rose, and the sun set, and the sun rose again, waiting for the next courier to pass through on their way to the confluence. The escorts in the sky had multiplied. What had started as 3 or 4 serpentine forms had become dozens, then hundreds, until the entire night sky writhed with creatures that swam through air like it was their natural element. They sang along with the crate now, their voices adding descant harmonies that made my fillings ache and turned my dreams into memories of drowning in oceans that had never existed on any map. The landscape around me was changing too. The familiar scrubland and pine forests of northern Florida were being replaced by something that belonged on the ocean floor. Coral formations grew alongside the highway, rising from the asphalt like underwater gardens. Schools of fish swam through the air between the trees, their scales catching light from street lamps that had turned blue-green and flickered like bioluminescent creatures in the deepest trenches. My truck was adapting to its new environment. The engine ran quieter, more efficiently, like it was breathing water instead of air. The tires gripped the road differently, finding purchase on surfaces that seemed to flow like liquid while remaining solid enough to drive on. Even the radio had evolved, picking up transmissions from radio stations that broadcast from cities built in underwater canyons, playing music composed for instruments that existed only in the deepest parts of the ocean. Around 4 a.m, near what my GPS insisted was Lake Okeechobee, but looked more like an inland sea, my truck began overheating. Not the engine, me. The temperature gauge read normal, but I was burning up, sweat in salt water that tasted of ancient depths and forgotten civilizations. I pulled over and popped the hood, expecting to find mechanical problems. Instead, I found that my truck had grown gills. Actual gills. Slits in the metal behind the headlights that opened and closed rhythmically, filtering something from the air that wasn't quite oxygen and wasn't quite water, but something in between. The radiator was full of seawater, but not ordinary seawater. This was water from the deepest trenches under pressure that should have crushed the engine block, teeming with microorganisms that glowed with their own internal light. When I touched it, the water moved toward my finger, like it recognized me, like it wanted to be part of whatever I was becoming. I walked around to check the crate and found that the brass locks had evolved. What had started as simple mechanical devices had become living things, growing and changing like coral polyps. The Etruscan script had been replaced by writing that seemed to swim across the metal surface, words that appeared and disappeared, and reformed into new configurations that told the story of civilizations that had risen and fallen beneath the waves. The breathing from inside the crate had changed too, deeper, more complex, like whatever was in there was not just waking up, but remembering how to exist in a world that had forgotten it was mostly water. When I put my ear against the iron, I could hear something that might have been singing, but singing in a language that predated the invention of music. The melody was mathematical, each note precisely calculated to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of water, salt, and the electromagnetic field generated by living creatures under pressure. My phone showed new coordinates, but they were moving in real time, drifting south through the Florida wilderness like something alive. The depth readings had reached 3,000 feet below sea level, even though I was standing on what appeared to be solid ground. According to the GPS, I was driving through the Puerto Rico Trench, following roads that ran along the continental shelf towards something that waited in waters so deep that no human had ever returned from exploring them. The escorts in the sky had become so numerous that they blocked out the stars. But they weren't blocking the light. They were replacing it. Each creature glowed with bioluminescence that painted the landscape in blues and greens and colours that didn't have names because human eyes had never evolved to perceive them. The night sky had become a living thing, undulating with tides and currents that followed lunar schedules for moons that orbited distant planets. When I looked in my mirrors, I saw that my truck's shadow was no longer a shadow. It was a portal, a window into somewhere else, showing glimpses of underwater highways where vehicles swam instead of drove, where the traffic lights were jellyfish and the road signs were carved from whalebone. But more disturbing than that was my own reflection. The changes were accelerating now, becoming impossible to ignore. My skin had taken on a greyish-blue tint, like something that had spent its entire life in the deep ocean. The gills behind my ears were fully functional, automatically adjusting to filter oxygen from whatever medium I found myself in. My eyes had developed a nictitating membrane that let me see clearly underwater, and when I smiled I glimpsed rows of sharp teeth that definitely hadn't been there when I'd started this delivery. The brass key the attendant had given me was warm in my pocket, pulsing with its own heartbeat. When I pulled it out, I could see that it was growing, developing new teeth and wards, becoming more complex as it adapted to whatever lock it was destined to open. The final coordinates led me down a road that existed in the spaces between officially mapped highways. Ancient live oaks formed a canopy so dense that the bioluminescent escorts swimming overhead became visible only as patches of moving light filtering through leaves that had adapted to photosynthesize underwater. Spanish moss hung like jellyfish tentacles, and the air grew so humid I could barely tell the difference between breathing and drowning. The road ended at something that never appeared on any map. The ruins of what had once been a Spanish colonial fort rose from water that was definitely not supposed to be there. But calling them ruins was inaccurate. This was architecture that had been built for amphibious use, designed by minds that understood that the distinction between land and sea was temporary at best. Stone walls rose from foundations that disappeared into dark water, and the battlements were carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. This wasn't a fort that had been flooded. This was a fort that had been built for flooding, designed to function as both a terrestrial structure and an underwater palace. The Spanish had been here, but they'd built on foundations laid by something much older, something that had understood the true nature of Florida's relationship with the ocean. 12 figures waited around a stone altar in the fort's central courtyard. They wore robes that had once been white but had turned the colour of kelp forests, and when they moved, I could see that the fabric was alive, woven from the same material as the escorts that swam through the sky above us. The altar itself was a masterpiece of impossible engineering, made from black stone that seemed to absorb light. It was covered in growths that looked like coral but moved like muscles, contracting and expanding in rhythm, with tides that existed in oceans halfway around the world. Barnacles covered every surface, but these weren't ordinary barnacles. They were opening and closing to reveal crystalline structures inside, each one resonating with different frequencies that combined to form a song that made reality seem negotiable. The leader of the group approached my truck, and when he spoke, I realized he wasn't using his voice. The words appeared directly in my mind, transmitted through water vapor in the air that had been structured to carry information the way fiber optic cables carry light. "The confluence opens," he said without speaking. "The Deep Mother has been patient beyond measure, but patience is finite, and the time for waiting has ended. You have brought us the key to the surface world, and now the surface world will remember its place in the greater ocean. I'm just here to make a delivery." He laughed, and the sound came from everywhere at once. The water around our feet, the air above our heads, the stone walls of the fort. "Oh, my friend, you stopped being just anything the moment you accepted your first envelope. Every package you've delivered, every mile you've driven, every night you've spent breathing salt air and dreaming of drowning, all of it has been preparation for this moment." That's when I noticed that they all had gills, but not simple gills, like mine. These were complex respiratory systems that could process any medium: air, water, or the thick substance that seemed to exist in the spaces between the two. Some of the cultists had been human once, I could tell, but others had always been something else, amphibious beings that had lived in the borderlands between worlds since before humans had learned to distinguish between mythology and biology. "How long have you been waiting here?" "Time moves differently at the confluence," the leader replied. "Some of us have been here since the Spanish arrived and found this place already ancient. Others will arrive tomorrow, or yesterday, or next century. When you serve powers that exist outside linear time, temporal distinctions become suggestions rather than laws. They used tools to break the locks on my crate, but these weren't human tools. They were living instruments, creatures bred specifically for the task of opening containers that held pieces of reality too dangerous for casual handling. Each lock required a different organism, and each organism sang a different note that resonated with the frequencies that kept the prison stable. When the final lock opened, the change was immediate and overwhelming. Water didn't just pour from the crate, reality poured from the crate. The substance that emerged was denser than water, more complex than any liquid that existed in the surface world. It moved with purpose and intelligence, flowing upward in defiance of gravity, spreading outward in patterns that formed temporary ecosystems in the air itself. Things lived in that water, not just fish or marine life, but creatures that had evolved in environments where the laws of physics were more fluid, more open to negotiation. Jellyfish, the size of houses, drifted through the air, their bells pulsing with bioluminescence that rewrote the local electromagnetic spectrum. Schools of fish swam in perfect mathematical formations that spelled out equations describing the relationship between pressure, depth, and transformation. And then something much larger began to unfold. I had expected a monster, some tentacled horror that would drive me insane just by existing. Instead, what emerged from the crate was a presence so fundamentally real that everything else seemed pale by comparison. This wasn't a creature that violated the laws of physics. This was a creature that had written those laws in the first place, before they'd been diluted by the compromises necessary for dry land existence. Anakette stood 15 feet tall when fully extended, but stood wasn't the right word because she existed in dimensions that didn't require contact with any surface. Her body was like a crocodile's, but built for pressures that would crush diamond and temperatures that would freeze helium solid. 4 arms emerged from her torso, each ending in hands that had evolved for manipulating tools and concepts that wouldn't be invented for another million years. Her head was crowned with living coral that formed patterns too complex for human mathematics. a natural computer that processed information from every ocean on Earth simultaneously. But it was her eyes that made me understand the true scope of what I'd helped unleash. Not alien or incomprehensible, but familiar in a way that suggested she'd been watching through my eyes for longer than I'd been alive. This was what the ocean had been before humans had divided it into separate bodies of water. This was what intelligence looked like when it had evolved under pressures that turned coal into diamonds and had millions of years to contemplate the relationship between thought and reality. When Anakette spoke, the words came from the water itself, transmitted through vibrations that rewrote the molecular structure of everything they touched. "Child of the surface," she said, and her voice was the sound of every wave that had ever broken against every shore. "You have served faithfully in ignorance, but ignorance ends tonight. The barriers between the deep places and the shallow places have grown too thin to maintain, and the time has come for reunification." The cultists walked into the rising water with expressions of perfect peace, but they weren't drowning. They were transforming, their human features becoming more fluid, more adapted for life, in an environment where the distinction between breathing and swimming had never existed. Their robes dissolved into scales, their prayers became sonar, and their devotion became the kind of perfect efficiency that evolution produced when it had unlimited time and pressure to work with. "I had a choice," I said, remembering the brass key that was now burning like ice in my pocket. "Someone told me there was always a choice." Anakette's laugh was like the sound of glaciers carving into the sea, beautiful and terrifying and utterly inevitable. "Indeed, you may choose to serve as you are, retaining enough of your surface nature to function as an intermediary between worlds, or you may choose to serve as we are, perfect and patient and utterly adapted for the deep places. But serve you will, because service is the natural relationship between the temporary and the eternal." I looked down at my hands and saw that the webbing between my fingers had become complex and beautiful, designed for manipulating currents and pressure differentials with the precision of a concert pianist. The gills behind my ears were processing not just oxygen, but information, filtering knowledge from the water around us and integrating it into my understanding of how reality worked when it wasn't constrained by the arbitrary limitations of dry land existence. The brass key was no longer brass. It had become something that existed in more dimensions than three, a tool for opening locks that secured concepts rather than containers. When I pulled it from my pocket, Anakette's four eyes focused on it with something that might have been surprise, if creatures that had existed since before surprise was invented could still experience new emotions. "The key of the deep current," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the coral on her head pulse with colours that didn't have names. I had wondered what became of that particular tool. "Do you understand what it opens?" I didn't, but as soon as the question was asked, the knowledge flowed into my mind like water finding its level. The key opened the door between willing transformation and forced evolution, between maintaining some essence of what I had been and becoming something entirely new, between serving as a translator and serving as a native speaker. "Use it," Anakette said, and her voice carried the authority of geological time. "But understand that once opened, some doors cannot be closed. Choose carefully what you wish to preserve of your surface nature." I could feel the fort sinking around us, but not collapsing, descending with purpose and grace into water that had always been there, waiting beneath a few feet of temporary dry land. The Spanish stones disappeared beneath the surface, but they didn't crumble or erode. They simply took their proper place in an architecture that spanned multiple states of matter, buildings that functioned equally well in air, water, or the complex medium that existed in the spaces between. My truck was already completely submerged, but it hadn't stopped working. Through the rising water, I could see it continuing to idle, its gills processing whatever the engine needed from its new environment. The empty crate floated beside it, no longer a prison but a doorway, a portal through which other things would travel when the barriers between worlds became permeable enough. I held the key between my thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight in dimensions I couldn't see, and made my choice. The lock I opened wasn't physical. It existed somewhere between my heart and my mind, securing the boundary between what I had been and what I could become. When I turned the key, I felt something fundamental shift in my relationship, not just with water, but with reality itself. The transformation that followed was not painful. It was completion. Every breath I'd ever taken had been preparation for breathing water. Every step I'd ever walked had been practice for swimming through environments where direction was negotiable and distance was measured in pressure rather than miles. Every thought I'd ever had about the ocean had been my mind preparing for integration with something vast enough to think in tidal cycles and dream in continental drift. When it was finished, I was still Tom Walker, but I was also something more, something that could exist comfortably in the deep places while retaining enough surface memory to navigate the borderlands between worlds. I was Anakette's courier, but I was also my own person, transformed but not consumed, serving ancient powers while maintaining the autonomy to choose how that service was performed. The water around us had become a living thing, responding to Anakette's presence by restructuring itself into environments suitable for amphibious life. Coral gardens grew in the space of minutes, providing both shelter and communication networks. Schools of fish swam in formations that carried messages between distant oceans, updating Anakette on the status of awakening projects around the globe. Because this wasn't just happening in Florida. Through the water, I could sense similar confluences, opening in coastal cities around the world. Ancient powers stirring in trenches that had been mapped, but never truly explored. Underground rivers connecting to surface waters in ways that would redraw every map and rewrite every textbook about how the world's water systems actually functioned. "Your first assignment," Anakette said, and her voice came from inside my head now, transmitted through water that flowed in my bloodstream. "The surface dwellers have built their cities without proper consideration for tidal forces. They will need guidance in adapting their infrastructure for amphibious use. You will serve as liaison, helping them understand that the choice is not between land and sea, but between cooperation and submersion." She handed me an envelope. Not paper, but something woven from kelp and starlight that could carry messages between dimensions. Inside were coordinates for 13 major coastal cities, each one marked with symbols indicating the type of adaptation required. Some needed new transportation systems for populations that would soon develop gills. Others needed architectural modifications for buildings that would spend half their time underwater. All of them needed someone who could speak both languages, the language of the surface world and the deeper tongue that Anakette's people had been speaking since before the first fish had crawled onto dry land. "The old contracts are being honoured," she continued, and I understood that she was talking about agreements made so long ago that they predated human civilization. The surface world borrowed space from the ocean, and now the loan is being called in. But we are not conquerors. We are reclamation specialists. Those who adapt will thrive in the new environment. Those who resist will simply become part of the ocean floor, where they will have eternity to reconsider their position. I looked around at what had once been a Spanish fort and was now a thriving underwater city. The cultists had completed their transformation and were already at work, building structures that would serve as embassies between the surface world and the deep places. Fish swam through the air as easily as through water, and jellyfish drifted between the trees like living lanterns, providing light for creatures that were learning to see in new spectrums. What about the people who can't adapt? Anakette's expression was not cruel, but it carried the patient inevitability of continental drift. Evolution is not optional. It is merely a question of timing. Some will adapt quickly and retain more of their original nature. Others will adapt slowly and become something entirely new. But all will adapt, because adaptation is the only alternative to extinction, and extinction serves no one's interests. I understood now why I'd been chosen for this work. Not just because I was expendable, or because I'd proven willing to transport strange cargo without asking questions. I'd been chosen because I was capable of change while maintaining continuity, the perfect liaison between worlds that operated on different principles but needed to learn to coexist. The envelope in my hand contained more than coordinates. It contained access codes for communication networks that spanned the globe, connecting every major body of water through currents that carried information as well as nutrients, translation matrices for converting surface languages into the deeper tongues that Anakette's people had been developing for millions of years, and most importantly, authorization to begin the integration process in whatever way seemed most likely to minimize casualties and maximize successful transformation. I was no longer just a delivery driver. I was a diplomat, a translator and agent of necessary change in a world that was about to remember its aquatic origins. The water around us was warm now, heated by geothermal vents that Anakette had awakened deep beneath the Florida aquifer. Fish that had never existed in surface waters swam past in schools that formed living murals, telling the story of the deep places in moving pictures that changed as I watched. Coral grew in fractal patterns that served as both art and architecture, creating spaces that were beautiful to inhabit and perfectly functional for amphibious life. When do I start? Anakette's smile revealed teeth that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution, perfect tools for an environment where efficiency was survival and beauty was function. You started 2 years ago when you accepted your first envelope. Everything since then has been preparation. Now begins the actual work. She gestured towards the surface where I could see the lights of distant cities reflected in water that stretched to the horizon. The surface dwellers are already beginning to change whether they realize it or not. Their dreams are full of drowning that feels like homecoming. Their children are being born with webbed fingers and an instinctive understanding of tidal mathematics. The transformation has already begun. Your job is simply to help it proceed as smoothly as possible. I began swimming toward the surface, moving through water that was both liquid and atmosphere, breathing through gills that processed whatever medium I found myself in. The envelope in my hand was warm and alive, updating itself with new information as conditions changed around the globe. My first assignment was waiting in Miami, where the ocean had begun rising in ways that couldn't be explained by climate change alone. The city's infrastructure was adapting spontaneously, buildings growing gills and developing the ability to function both above and below water. The human population was having dreams about breathing underwater, and a significant percentage of newborns were showing aquatic adaptations that their parents didn't yet understand. I would arrive as a representative of the New World Order, helping the city's government understand what was happening and how to work with it rather than against it. I would explain that the changes were not catastrophic, but evolutionary, not destructive, but integrative. The ocean was not conquering the land. The ocean was remembering that the land had always been a temporary loan, and now it was time to renegotiate the terms. When I broke the surface, the night sky was full of creatures that swam through air as easily as through water, their bioluminescence turning the darkness into a living constellation. In the distance, I could see other cities beginning to glow with the same light, coastal populations awakening to their aquatic heritage and learning to breathe in dimensions they'd never known existed. The age of pure surface dwelling was ending. The age of amphibious civilization was about to begin, and I was going to help it happen, one delivery at a time. The envelope in my hand pulsed with warmth and possibility, containing coordinates for a future that would be strange and beautiful and utterly inevitable. I'd been transformed from a simple courier into something far more important. A guide for a species learning to remember what it had been before it had ever left the ocean. The deep places were calling, and finally the surface world was ready to answer. The envelope in my hand had become a living thing, its kelp fibers extending tiny tendrils that interfaced directly with my nervous system. Information flowed between us, not words or images, but pure understanding. I could see the entire scope of the project now, the careful orchestration that had been years in the planning. Delivery drivers in 47 cities around the world, all carrying similar cargo, each one carefully selected, not for their skills or reliability, but for their capacity to adapt while maintaining continuity. We were the advanced team, the translators who would help two worlds learn to speak the same language. In Seattle, a woman named Patricia was delivering something that hummed with the frequency of Pacific currents to a warehouse that existed only during king tides. In Boston, a man called Rodriguez was transporting a crate that leaked memories of whaling ships and colonial harbours to coordinates that placed him somewhere beneath the harbour itself. In Tokyo, someone whose name existed only in pictographs was carrying pieces of tsunami dreams to shrines that had been built on foundations much older than any recorded history. We were all part of the same delivery network, couriers in service to something vast and patient that had been planning this reunion for longer than human civilization had existed. But Miami was my responsibility, my territory, my chance to prove that transformation didn't have to mean destruction. I surfaced 3 miles offshore, where the water was deep enough that the city's lights looked like bioluminescent creatures in the distance. My body had adapted completely now. I could process oxygen from air or water with equal efficiency, and my vision had developed the ability to see in spectrums that revealed the true nature of the changes already taking place. The ocean around Miami was alive with activity. Coral reefs were growing in fast forward, forming new structures that would serve as foundation points for the city's aquatic expansion. Schools of fish swam in patterns that cleared debris from underwater construction sites, and jellyfish drifted through the water column like living spotlights, illuminating work being done by creatures that had never appeared in any marine biology textbook. But most importantly, the city itself was already changing. Through the water, I could see the root systems that Miami's buildings were developing, anchoring structures that had been designed for dry land into bedrock that would soon be submerged. The Biscayne Bay Aquarium had sprouted gills along its walls, allowing it to function as both air-filled and water-filled habitat. Office buildings in the financial district were growing organic filtration systems, preparing for the day when their lower floors would be permanently flooded, but still fully functional. The transformation wasn't random or chaotic. It was following blueprints that had been embedded in the city's infrastructure from the beginning, architectural DNA that was finally being activated by Anakette's presence in the continental water table. I swam towards shore, following currents that had been redirected to carry me exactly where I needed to be. The water temperature rose as I approached the coast, warmed by geothermal systems that were awakening throughout the Florida bedrock. Small fish swam alongside me, their scales carrying messages in languages of light that updated me on the status of the integration process. The beach where I made landfall didn't exist on any map. It was a temporary structure, a sandbar that had formed overnight in response to tidal forces that were being directed by intelligence rather than simple physics. Palm trees grew from sand that was part terrestrial soil and part pulverized coral, their roots extending into both air and water. Waiting for me was a car that had never been manufactured by any human company. The vehicle looked normal enough, a black sedan with tinted windows and government plates. But when I approached, I could see that it was breathing. Gills opened and closed along its sides, and the tires had developed the ability to grip wet surfaces with the efficiency of octopus tentacles. The interior was filled with air that was exactly the right temperature and humidity for amphibious comfort. A briefcase waited on the passenger seat, made from materials that existed in the spaces between organic and manufactured. Inside were documents that would establish my credentials as a federal liaison specializing in coastal adaptation, business cards that changed their text depending on who was reading them, and a cell phone that could place calls to numbers that existed in dimensions beyond the normal telecommunications grid. My first appointment was at Miami City Hall with the mayor and the City Planning Commission. According to my schedule, they were expecting someone from the Department of Oceanic Integration, a federal agency that had been established overnight and backdated through bureaucratic systems that were more fluid than most people realized. The drive through Miami was like traveling through a city in the process of remembering a dream. Construction crews worked on projects that hadn't been approved by any city council, installing infrastructure that would be necessary for amphibious life. Streetlights were being replaced with bioluminescent alternatives that would function underwater. Storm drains were being retrofitted as two-way systems that could channel water either away from or toward the areas that needed it most. The workers themselves showed signs of adaptation. Some had developed the enhanced lung capacity necessary for holding their breath during extended underwater work. Others had grown the kind of nictitating membranes that would protect their eyes in saltwater environments. A few showed the early stages of gill development, though they seemed unaware of the changes occurring in their own physiology. Citizens went about their daily routines, but their behavior was subtly different. People stood closer to windows when it rained, as if the sound of water had become more compelling than it used to be. Children played games that involved holding their breath for impossible lengths of time, and adults found themselves drawn to seafood restaurants with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. The dreams had started weeks ago, according to the radio talk shows I picked up as I drove. Thousands of Miami residents were reporting the same recurring dream, swimming through underwater cities that felt more like home than any place they'd ever lived, breathing water as easily as air, communicating with sea creatures that spoke in languages of color and electrical current. Psychologists were calling it mass hysteria. Marine biologists were calling it species memory. The few people who understood what was really happening were calling it the beginning of the most important evolutionary leap in human history. City Hall was a masterpiece of unconscious adaptation. The building had been constructed in the 1920s, but somehow its architects had incorporated design elements that would prove essential for amphibious use 90 years later. The lobby could be flooded without damaging any essential systems. The elevators were sealed units that could function underwater. The mayor's office had windows that could open to provide both air and water access. Mayor Cristina Valdez was waiting for me in a conference room that smelled faintly of seawater, despite being 15 floors above sea level. She was a woman in her early 50s who had been having the dreams longer than most, and the changes in her physiology were more advanced than she probably realized. When she shook my hand, I noticed the slight webbing between her fingers and the way her pupils dilated in response to the fluorescent lights, as if her eyes were adapting for vision in darker, deeper environments. "Mr. Walker," she said, though I hadn't told her my name, and it wasn't on any of the identification I'd shown her assistant. "Thank you for coming. We need to discuss some unusual developments in the city's infrastructure." The Planning Commission was already assembled around a conference table covered with blueprints that changed as I watched them. The city's water management system was redrawing itself in real time, responding to subsurface changes that the engineers couldn't explain but were learning to accommodate. "The flooding started 3 weeks ago," explained the chief engineer, a man named Rodriguez, whose fingernails had turned the color of barnacles. "But it's not following any of our models. The water is coming from underground sources that don't appear on any geological survey, and it's flowing upward through pipes that should be carrying it in the opposite direction. More concerning," added the head of emergency management, "is that the flooding doesn't seem to be causing any damage. Buildings that should be condemned are functioning better than ever. Electrical systems that should have shorted out are running more efficiently than when they were first installed. It's like the city is adapting to aquatic conditions on its own. I opened my briefcase and retrieved documents that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier, but now carried the full authority of federal agencies that had been established through congressional acts that had been retroactively inserted into legislative history. What you're experiencing, I said, watching their faces as they processed information that their conscious minds weren't ready to accept, but their deeper instincts recognized as truth, is the beginning of a planned transition to amphibious urban infrastructure. The Department of Oceanic Integration has been preparing for this eventuality for decades. I spread photographs across the table, images of cities that existed in dimensions adjacent to our own, places where the boundaries between land and sea had never been established in the rigid way that surface civilizations insisted upon, underwater districts that functioned as efficiently as any terrestrial neighborhood, buildings that served equally well as air-filled offices and water-filled habitats, transportation systems that moved through 3 dimensions instead of being limited to horizontal surfaces. This is what Miami is becoming, I explained, not destroyed by rising seas, but transformed into something more adaptable, more resilient, more suited to the realities of a planet that is mostly water. The mayor leaned forward, and I could see that her eyes had developed the kind of reflective layer that would allow for enhanced vision in low-light underwater conditions. Are you saying this is intentional? That someone planned for Miami to flood? I'm saying that Miami was always meant to be an amphibious city, I replied, retrieving more documents from a briefcase that seemed to contain exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. The original city planners incorporated design elements that wouldn't make sense for purely terrestrial use, but are perfect for a civilization that exists both above and below water. They were following blueprints they didn't understand, guided by instincts that were preparing for this transition. I showed them aerial photographs of Miami taken from angles that revealed patterns invisible from ground level. The city's layout formed shapes that were clearly aquatic in inspiration, flowing curves that channeled water rather than blocking it, open spaces that served as tidal pools, transportation networks that formed spirals reminiscent of nautilus shells. Your ancestors built Miami as an amphibious city, I continued. They just didn't realize it at the time. The chief engineer studied the blueprints with growing recognition. These flow patterns, they match what we're seeing in the flood zones. The water is following routes that were planned into the original city layout. Because the water isn't flooding the city, I explained. The city is remembering how to breathe. Over the next 6 hours, I walked the planning commission through the integration process. The changes happening to Miami's infrastructure weren't random or destructive. They were part of a carefully orchestrated transformation that would result in a city capable of functioning equally well in air and water. The flood zones weren't disaster areas. They were preview environments showing residents what amphibious life would be like. The fish that were appearing in previously landlocked areas weren't invasive species. They were native life forms that had been waiting underground for conditions to become suitable for their emergence. The dreams that thousands of residents were experiencing weren't psychological phenomena. They were inherited memories, genetic programming that was being activated by changes in the local electromagnetic field caused by awakening geological processes. What about the people who don't want to adapt? Asked the emergency management director. What about citizens who want to relocate to higher ground? There is no higher ground, I replied, and showed them satellite images that revealed the true scope of the transformation. This is happening to every coastal city simultaneously. Boston, Seattle, New Orleans, San Francisco. They're all experiencing the same integration process. The choice isn't between adaptation and relocation. The choice is between adaptation and extinction. but I softened the statement with maps showing how the transformation would actually improve quality of life for most residents, lower crime rates in amphibious districts, because underwater neighbourhoods were naturally more communal and collaborative, improved air quality because buildings with gills filtered pollutants more efficiently than any mechanical system, enhanced transportation options because three-dimensional movement was faster and more energy efficient than being limited to horizontal surfaces. The children are adapting fastest, observed the head of the school district, a woman whose voice had developed the kind of harmonic undertones that would carry clearly through water. We're seeing physiological changes that seem to be accelerating with each generation. Enhanced lung capacity, improved underwater vision, an intuitive understanding of tidal mathematics that our best marine biology students don't achieve after years of study. Because they're not learning new skills, I explained. They're remembering abilities that humans possessed before we separated ourselves from our aquatic origins. The children are simply returning to a more complete version of what we've always been. I spent the afternoon touring the city with officials who were beginning to understand that their job wasn't to fight the changes, but to help them proceed as smoothly as possible. We visited schools where children were learning to read and write underwater, using tablets that functioned in both air and liquid environments. We toured hospitals where medical equipment was adapting to serve patients who were developing gills and enhanced pressure tolerance. We inspected transportation hubs where the subway system was being converted into an underwater network that would connect Miami to other amphibious cities along the coast. Everywhere we went, I saw the same pattern. Infrastructure that was evolving to serve a population that was remembering how to live in 3 dimensions, instead of being limited to a flat surface. But the most remarkable change was in the people themselves. Citizens who had been struggling with depression and anxiety were reporting dramatic improvements in their mental health as they spent more time in or near water. Individuals with chronic respiratory conditions were finding that their symptoms disappeared when they learned to use their developing gills. Children who had been diagnosed with learning disabilities were demonstrating advanced cognitive abilities when tested in aquatic environments. The transformation wasn't taking anything away from human potential. It was unlocking capabilities that had been dormant since our species had made the evolutionary mistake of limiting itself to dry land. As evening approached, I found myself at the Miami Sea Aquarium, which had become the unofficial headquarters for the city's integration program. The facility had always been designed to house aquatic life, but now it was serving as a training ground for humans who were learning to function in underwater environments. The head marine biologist, Dr. Elena Santos, showed me around exhibits that were being used to help residents understand their changing physiology. Tanks that had once held dolphins were now serving as swimming pools where people could practice breathing underwater. Former seal habitats had been converted into meeting spaces where community leaders could discuss integration challenges while floating in their natural amphibious state. The remarkable thing, Dr. Santos explained as we watched a group of teenagers playing a game that involves swimming through underwater obstacle courses while solving complex mathematical problems, is how natural it all seems. These kids didn't need training to develop these abilities. They just needed permission to stop suppressing them. She showed me data from the past 3 weeks that documented the changes occurring in Miami's population. Average lung capacity had increased by 30%. Underwater vision had improved by factors that shouldn't have been physiologically possible. Most significantly, brain scans showed that residents were developing new neural pathways that allowed for processing information in 3 dimensions instead of the 2-dimensional thinking that characterized most surface-dwelling cultures. "Are there any negative side effects?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "None that we can identify," she replied. "If anything, people seem healthier, happier, more cognitively flexible than they were before the changes started. The only individuals experiencing problems are those who are actively fighting the transformation instead of working with it." As if to demonstrate her point, she introduced me to a group of community leaders who had been among the first to embrace their aquatic heritage. They moved through the water with a grace that would have taken years to develop through conventional swimming lessons, but they had achieved it in a matter of weeks simply by accepting what their bodies were naturally trying to do. The key, explained one of them, a former city councilman, whose name was now spoken in harmonic tones that carried clearly through both air and water, is understanding that we're not becoming something alien. We're becoming something we've always been, underneath the artificial limitations we imposed on ourselves when we decided that living on land was somehow more sophisticated than living in the ocean. By the time I returned to my hotel, a building that had grown gills along its foundation and now served guests who were equally comfortable in air-filled or water-filled rooms, I understood that Miami's integration was proceeding better than anyone had hoped. The city wasn't being destroyed by rising seas. It was being liberated from the constraints of purely terrestrial existence. The residents weren't losing their humanity. They were discovering that humanity had always been more expansive than they'd been taught to believe. I spent the evening writing my report, using instruments that transmitted information through water rather than electromagnetic signals. My words would travel through underground currents to other integration specialists working in other cities, sharing techniques and strategies that would help the global transformation proceed as smoothly as possible. The envelope that had brought me to Miami had served its purpose, but my work was just beginning. Tomorrow, I would travel to the next city on my list, then the next, helping communities around the world understand that the changes they were experiencing weren't catastrophic, but evolutionary. The age of pure surface dwelling was ending, but the age of amphibious civilization was just beginning, and I was privileged to serve as a guide for a species that was finally remembering how to live in harmony with the planet that had given it birth. The ocean was calling, and finally, humanity was ready to come home. But as I prepared for sleep in a bed that could function equally well above or below water, I received one final message through the communication networks that connected all integration specialists. It was from Anakette herself, transmitted through currents that flowed beneath every continent and every ocean floor. Phase 1 complete, the message said in harmonics that made my newly developed gills flutter with recognition. Prepare for Phase 2. The deep dwellers are ready to make contact. I looked out my hotel window at a Miami that was glowing with bioluminescence, where citizens moved through air and water with equal ease, where children played games that would have been impossible for purely terrestrial life forms. This had been the easy part, helping surface dwellers remember their aquatic heritage. Phase 2 would involve contact with intelligences that had never left the deep places, beings that had been watching and waiting while humanity played at being land animals. The real integration was about to begin. I fell asleep to the sound of whale song that seemed to be coming from the city's water mains, dreaming of meetings yet to come between the temporary surface world and the eternal depths that had always been humanity's true home. The deliveries would continue, but now I understood what we were really transporting. Not just packages and cargo, but pieces of a future where the boundaries between land and sea existed only in the memories of a species that had finally remembered how to breathe.